about $9,700 a year. It's 44% below the federal poverty level. Now, in the early 90s, and recession of the early 90s, if you were 20% below the federal poverty level, you would qualify for cash assistance. Not so now. You have to be much poorer in Michigan to qualify. So when we think about that gap between 44% below the poverty level and poverty, there are a lot of folks in there that aren't getting any help. We have fewer than a third of children in Michigan that are below the poverty level that receive cash assistance. And only a quarter of children who receive food stamps receive cash assistance. So we've got a big gap here. We think that a couple of other reasons for the change in eligibility and the really an artificial depression, I think, of the caseloads is the fact that, and we have to keep these eligibility levels low because it's a budget issue. Now, if you think back to 1997, when President Clinton signed the Welfare Reform Bill, prior to that, we had the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program. It was an entitlement program. And when our unemployment rate went up in Michigan and every other state, those caseloads would go up proportionately. We don't have an entitlement program anymore. We turned welfare into a block grant program. Each state receives a block grant. Ours is a TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Family Block Grant. And the amount of money that Michigan receives from the federal government today, $775 million, is the same amount of money that we got from the federal government when the legislation was passed in 1997. So, and the state has not anteed up to make up that difference, and so we've kept our eligibility levels low. We also, in late 2006, toughened our sanction policies. And so it's when families are determined not to have cooperated with the work requirement, it used to be that the grant stopped for 30 days. If it happened again, it'd be another 30 days. If it happened a third time, it would be 3 months. Now it's a 90-day sanction for the first time, a 90-day sanction for the second time, and a full year, 12 months, for the third sanction. So those are large chunks of time when families don't have incomes. So that, I hope, provides an explanation of why we think that those lines on page 3 are going down, why the trend lines are going down. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, moving to page 4, and kind of move to a budget discussion. I've alluded to the fact that we as a state aren't responding to the need that these programs, are intended to address, partly because of a fiscal crisis that we have been in since 2001. We cut, and some of this is self-inflicted, and I can't stress that enough. It's not just the economy. Bill Clinton used to say it's the economy, stupid. Well, it's not just the economy. We cut taxes in Michigan aggressively throughout the 1990s, including enactment of multi-year tax cuts in 1999 that we continued even as we slid into a recession. We kept up with those tax cuts. So we made the decision to forego revenue and to continue to forego that revenue. That has been exacerbated now by this seismic dislocation in the auto industry and by the national financial crisis that we're in now. We did take steps in 2007. You all remember when we shut down government for 4 hours and the legislature finally passed a tax increase to avoid making just horrendous budget cuts. Those tax increases are temporary. The income tax increase, the rate that was increased, will start to phase down in 2011, and the MBT surcharge is supposed to phase out in 2017. There's a bill in the legislature to phase it out in the next 2 years, and there's talk of even using the federal stimulus money for it, which I'll get to in a minute. So the result is in Michigan that we have what's called a structural deficit. And we've been talking about the league structural deficit for several years now, and I'm I'm really growing very weary of it, but other people who should be talking about the structural deficit are finally starting to talk about it, so this is a good thing. We haven't done anything about it yet, but we're at least calling it what it is. So if you look at the next chart, bottom of page 4, a structural deficit, what we're talking about there is when the normal growth in programs, just the normal growth, inflation, is growing faster than revenues. And this is just the cost of operating programs, heating buildings, buying paper clips, it's increased caseloads, just all of those things are outpacing revenues. And so you can see where the state spending trend line, if we did nothing, if we didn't change our programs, we didn't change out eligibility, we didn't enhance our programs, they just continued as they are now into 2018, that's the top line. If the tax increases adopted in 2007 remained in place, that would be that middle dotted line in terms of the revenues that we would have available. If those tax increases phase out as they're scheduled to, that's the bottom line. And the gap between the top and the bottom is what we call a structural deficit. And when I say it's not just the economy, that deficit can't be fixed just by the economy turning around, because there are inherent problems with our tax structure, in part because of the tax cuts we enacted, and in part because of the design of our tax structure, which I'll also talk about. I appreciate Jim getting me water. I'm dealing with a sinus infection. So with all of that, we've also seen, even as we struggle to fund programs, we've seen a shift in our priorities. And so top of page 5 really lays it out in terms of where our spending has changed. Health and Human Services, higher education, revenue sharing have all decreased, while corrections has increased. Right now in Michigan, 1 in 3 state employees is employed by the Department of Corrections. 1 in every 5 general fund dollars is spent for the Department of Corrections. So we've seen just a huge shift in priorities. And we're going to be hearing more, I think, over the next many months about what do we do in the area of corrections, and I'll get to that. So when I talk to groups and you lay out, we've got this horrendous budget situation, and right now the legislature is dealing with a shortfall of $1.6 billion. The governor's budget that she presented to the legislature includes cuts. I think there's about $200 million in revenue increases, but the rest is all cuts in programs and services to close this $1.6 billion. That's huge. Our general fund budget is only $9 billion. So this is a big deficit, and this comes on the heels of over $4 billion in cuts since 2004. So we've been cutting and cutting and cutting. So what should we do? And I'm going to go through several suggestions, and I know I know it's dreary, but I hope at the end you'll feel motivated to talk to your elected officials, to really become informed about some of these things and let them know the kinds of changes that we need in Michigan at the state level. First, we need to use the federal stimulus money wisely. Michigan is going to be receiving at least $18 billion in federal stimulus money, and $2 billion of that is in Medicaid alone. $4 billion of it is money that can be used to shore up the state budget. A lot of this money will be roads, bridges, infrastructure projects, but the $4 billion